Even though I can't see the chat right now, I'd love if people can just go ahead and start throwing in some identities that come to mind when you're thinking about yourself, when you're thinking about others, when it comes to policy making, when it comes to policy writing in general. How do we kind of approach this? What are these identities? And with this, that context matters. So your oppressions, your marginalizations exist within the environment itself. So with that, whatever you're talking about, you want to lay out what you are considering and then how you want it to be considered. So when you're talking about a given topic, I gave an example right here. A topic is on climate change and how it impacts girls. You have the context there, climate change and girls, but you want to expand on that. What identities are we missing in this? What identities are often left out in topics like this? So, like I mentioned earlier, the first three starting points with people when they view somebody is race, gender, and age. And so, with this topic, we don't have the race included. We do have the gender, girls, and then with age, girls can kind of be assumed we're talking about adolescents. So people who haven't matured yet into being a woman. So we kind of have the age loosely though, but that's our starting point. How can we expand beyond that? I feel like sometimes what I see in a lot of policy writing and a lot of policy making it stops at this. It just stops at the race, gender, and maybe age. I don't even see age that often, but definitely race and gender. But people are more than this, and a lot of what they experience plays a role into this. So one of the ways that we can expand also, again, I can't see the chat, so I hope people are talking, but we have ethnicity, we have religion, nationality is also a really big one that I think plays such a large part, especially when you get into international affairs, how your nationality will play a role in whatever policy making or advocacy that you're doing. Of course, class is, I think, one of the biggest ones. I feel like that should be added within the top 3 and make it that top 4, that your class often will kind of dictate how people might treat you and how you also might go about existing in society as well. And then, of course, disability status. I feel like this is the one that gets left out so often, way too often, disability status. And there is no disability justice without including the justice for all. And so by promoting, these different layers, you want to see what you can include and how relevant they are to your topic. So sort of the final part with this is you want to think of it as oppression and marginalization. So who often is left behind? We're looking at these power structures. So really keep in mind these power dynamics. That can be a really great way of thinking about how to approach a policy. So whether you're writing on policy, whether you're advocating for a certain policy, whether you are in government and you're participating actively in that policy making, think of the power structures that be based off of the topic itself. So with this example of climate change and how it impacts girls, what power dynamics are included in that very broad topic? How can we address different identities and how they all interact with one another? Because climate change isn't impacting, this is an example, obviously, but climate change isn't impacting girls all the same. Me here in the United States and Washington, D.C., I'm not seeing the same effects of climate change in the same way that a girl living in a rural area in, let's say, Vietnam is experiencing it. So you want to think of how different is it for everybody and what do we want to address in this? And in that, you include why you will be addressing something a certain way. Why are you kind of prioritizing it, or why are you focusing on that? Why are you maybe considering leaving out a certain group if you're aware of it? I feel like that is a very responsible way of going about intersectionality, is addressing who you're including and also acknowledging who you might not be including and kind of giving a why to that, an explanation, because the entire point of intersectionality is to make sure that we are not leaving people behind. So when we are actively choosing to maybe not include a certain group, you do want to acknowledge that and say why it might not be seen as relevant in this. I hope you can hear me. I think they're cutting the grass outside, but do let me know if it starts to get too loud. So with that, I am also very much interested to hear what people might do with this topic on climate change and how it impacts girls. So since this is a workshop and we are going to be actively working towards how we can apply this, I'd love if we can go into some very brief, very quick breakout rooms where you all can talk together with each other on climate change and how it impacts girls. This is just a random topic again, and how you would adopt an intersectional lens to this topic. So I'm going to pause for a second to see if we can do the breakout rooms and also close my window. But oh, and yay, I'm seeing the chat now. So somebody said, oh, that's exactly what I'm working on right now. That's so great. Education, literacy, marital status. That is an excellent one. I think that is also very dependent on where somebody is located. Migration status, absolutely. Sexuality, religion, economic status. Yep, that ties in with class. I'm gonna close my window. Of course, like they're doing this right now. Um, and then I see fertility versus infertility. That is a really interesting one. Um, and that can tie in with a bunch of different things too. Rural versus urban. Absolutely. These are great identity markers that are often left behind. So I'm really glad that you all are very mindful of them. So if we can just go ahead and do those breakout rooms, I don't know if I should stop sharing for the time being. And then you guys can talk amongst each other how you would make the topic itself intersectional, climate change and girls. How can we expand that? Who do we want to include in that? Who do we often see not included in a topic like that? If you even want to make your own topic, if you don't want to do that one, but you have one in mind that you see that is often not included in the discussion of policy making or policy writing and the general space of advocacy, who is being left out and how can we bring them closer to the center? So yeah, if we could do those breakout rooms, I don't think I have control over that. Um, so, and probably just for like, I would say like 3 minutes is enough. And then we can come together and people who are comfortable sharing can share how they would go about a topic like this. Let's see. Do I do it? Or I don't know if I can since I'm not the host.
I think I did it. I'm on it.
Okay, great. I really am interested in the fertility versus infertility one. That's a really big marker, I think, of an identity. So, and I especially like marital status too. I feel like on my own, I sometimes forget that too and how that might impact somebody. But these are all great, especially migration status. And especially with climate change, with migration status. You know, what pushes somebody. We see forced and voluntary migration. And so that is often left out. So I think we'll do the breakout room soon. Currently working on the intersection of gender-based violence and postpartum depression among teenage mothers in Kenya and other 7 low middle income countries in Africa. That is an amazing topic, and I think that's like a textbook example of intersectionality. You're touching on so many different identities, but how they all play a role within one another. So how gender-based violence and postpartum depression come together, affecting teenage mothers specifically. You're looking at a very particular part of the population that might often be overlooked or judged given the context. And then you have the countries you're looking at and really looking at low and middle income countries. So that's bringing in economics too. That sounds super, super interesting. If anybody's working on anything super cool, please feel free to share once you're finished. I don't know how we can like keep that going, but that's something I would love to read. And sounds like amazing work. Okay, I think they're transitioning for the, thank you for your patience, but we'll get right into it. Okay, yeah, so breakout rooms are ready, so you can join. And I'll see you all later.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. Hi.
Yeah.
Hi, I don't know about you, but I was trying to turn on my mic, but I couldn't.
It's okay.
So, does anyone have something to share related to climate change and how it impacts women and girls? Is there any identity marker that you think it's particularly relevant when we analyze climate change and the impact on women and girls? For instance, for me, I really believe the migration status is a really important one, because, you know, migrant women, refugee women, they are heavily impacted by many different circumstances that we have to take into account. And climate change, it's one of them. So I wanted to hear your opinion on this. Do you have anything you want to share? Maybe you are working or you have studied this.
I am actually, may I?
Yes, of course.
Okay. So I was the one who wrote on the chat that I'm actually working right now on the subject. So first of all, I'm Khawla Irawi from Morocco. I'm a consultant in social development. So I do work a lot on gender-related studies. One of them is the one I'm currently working on, is the impact of climate change on women and young girls in Morocco, and specifically on three aspects: sexual and reproductive health, gender-based violence, and child marriage. I have conducted several focus groups with women. And I think one of the most important ones in the identity we're talking about is education or access to education. Excuse me?
I can't hear you.
Okay. I don't. Yes, we couldn't talk. Sorry, Kaola. I think you were interrupted. because of the mic situation. Paola, can you hear me? Can you open the mic? No.
Hello? Sorry, I got interrupted.
Please go ahead.
Can you hear me? Hello? I'm not sure if you can hear me, ladies.
Hi, we can hear you. We can.
Okay, so I was saying I don't want to monopolize the talk if someone else has something to share. Okay, so I was saying that I have conducted focus groups with women in urban and rural areas. I have conducted a survey for NGOs who work with these women, either directly or indirectly. And if the question here is about what are the identity elements that could reinforce the impacts of climate change, I would say the level of education. Of course, we're talking about how if the women had access to education and their families as well, because that is a direct impact that has a direct impact on whether they drop out of school early or they pursue their degrees. And if they drop out of school, they are immediately uh, assigned other gendered roles like helping out in domestic tasks and eventually getting married way very young. We are talking about child marriage here. That also conducts to gender-based violence and high risk in sexual and reproductive health. So that's my input. Hello?
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, can you hear me now? I'm trying to figure out, we are having some technical issues regarding the microphones. I don't know why.
Apparently, there are some people who are do not have the permission to activate the mic. Now I have, but before I couldn't.
Yeah, and that also happened to me even with the Politics4Her Zoom account. I'm trying to see what is happening.
Amelia, I can hear you.
You can hear me? Can you
Yeah.
try can you try to open the mics to see if it works? Or tell me in the chat.
It didn't work earlier, but now it works.
Okay. I'm so sorry for this inconvenience because I was really enjoying to hear you, Cole, and I think it's very interesting, especially the question of the level of education and how that actually impacts, has a huge impact. Does anyone wants to share something else? No. I'm not sure if you can or not right now.
Can I add something? If no
Yes,
one
of
has.
course.
So one of other aspects that has a large impact is the place of life, like whether it's rural area or urban area. It has a large impact.
Yes, I agree. I agree. Like, even if we are not talking about the climate change, I think it's an identity mark that is super important, but people tend to ignore it, I think, a little bit in policy making, because we tend to think, and right now I'm only thinking about my country, that the differences, between the rural and the urban space are much more faded away, but it's not like that. Even in countries like mine, Portugal, like in every country, like those differences are still huge when it comes to the impact they might have in other aspects of people's lives.
Absolutely, absolutely. I also want to add the socioeconomic as class.
Now we
Because
we can't hear because of internet connections, I believe, Paula.
I said I wanted to emphasize on socioeconomic levels, which the she referred to as social classes.
Yeah.
It is very important when we talk about climate change to talk about social classes, because the poorer the family is, the hardest the impact is on it. So, for example, if a family, I'm talking about Morocco, of course, if a family has not enough income or revenue to take one of their kids to school, they choose generally to take the boy to school to pursue its studies, not the woman. So the little girl drops out of school and the boy continues, because it is believed, and here comes the religious aspect, it is believed that the man should be the provider of the family, so he ought to study and increase his chances of finding a job against a woman's chance to find a job, because he is the one who's supposed to be the provider for his family, his future family. So
Yes, absolutely.
so here comes the baseline here is that it's a poor family, so they have to choose whether they take to school all of their kids or only the boys. And comes the religious aspect of identity, where it dictates that the man is solely the only provider for the family. So, in order
Yes.
for him to increase his job opportunities, he needs to pursue studies.
Yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, we need to end the breakout rooms because Deja is waiting for us, but we can discuss this also later with her. So I think it will be super interesting if you also share this with the rest of the participants. Thank you so much, Kaola, and sorry about my situation. See you in a bit.
Okay, great. Well, I hope everybody had like a good maybe talk or discussion on it. Um, the group I was in, they shared a lot of interesting topics. And if anybody wants to share, what they thought or what their group also brought in, please feel free to do so. But we were also talking about how this might impact immigrant women specifically. So looking at the legal status, that is something that should always be considered, especially when we're talking about a global issue like climate change. How does that impact people's legal immigration status? And then also a really interesting one was medical status too. So how might this impact people who have, battled certain cancers or other diseases, whether they are in recovery or they're still battling, how that might impact them. And then also women with children, which I thought was really an interesting one. When we're thinking of climate change and how people might be forced to move, how does that impact, mothers specifically, caregivers, people who have to be responsible for others, and especially responsible for such a vulnerable population. Children are one of the most vulnerable populations. So how does it feel to have to, keep them in mind when you're going? Um, so yeah, so if anybody else wants to share, please feel free to do so. You could do so in the chat if you want to unmute yourself. And then I'll jump right back in and we can also wrap up and ask any questions. Um, so I'll give like a second, but otherwise I'll just share my screen again and get back into it because we have about 15 minutes left. So I want to be mindful, respectful of everybody else's time. So yeah, I'll just go in and share my screen again. And if I can remember how to do that. Okay. So we talked about how it's not a buzzword. So this is something I also want to really be kept in mind. It's how these identities overlap, how they do not exist separately. I think sometimes people kind of approach it like that when it comes to intersectionality, that it's, your race and then your gender and then your class and then your immigration status, but it's everything all at once. It's how these things happen simultaneously. So it's how they play a role together. And it is not only concerned with how somebody is oppressed. I think that's how a lot of people think of the topic itself. And I think that's why some people turn away from it because they don't want to talk about oppression or they don't want to talk about how people might be oppressed. But this is also concerned with how somebody might hold privileges too. That is the really interesting thing that intersectionality tries to bring to the center is how complex our identities interact. And so how you can have certain oppressions, how you can be marginalized in certain ways, but you can also hold certain privileges, especially privileges over others that might be in one of your identity groups. So your environment is often what kind of decides how this might be taken into account. So this is another thing. You can also just add it into the chat if you don't want to unmute yourself, but maybe thinking that your own identities might play a role in this and how, the ways that you might be marginalized, but also what privileges you might hold. For myself, the one that really comes to mind, I mean, being a Black woman in the US, I obviously have certain oppressions that I might face, facing sexism, facing racism. But when I travel, when I leave the country, my nationality will often act as a privilege over others, depending on where I am. And I've seen that in a lot of places. I was in South Africa for a bit, and that was very outright how being Black, but being Black from another place in South Africa, how people treated me differently compared to the Black native South Africans. So that was a really interesting case study. So that's something I really also want people to be sort of mindful of is how you are both oppressed, you can face oppressions, but you will also have certain privileges. And it's being open about talking about those privileges. I think that's another thing that sometimes people are a bit reluctant to do so. But remember that this is how we've gotten here by being open about how we face the world, how we are treated, and being mindful of how you might, on a subconscious level, impact others and how your own privileges might play a role in somebody else's subordination. And so just being mindful of that and making sure that you're aware of that. But this is how your environment really touches on this. And so this was something I came across this morning and I would have loved to include it in the presentation, but when we think of, and this is just like an example of how depending on where you are, this plays a role. When we think of like disability studies, there is a really cool topic that has been emerging over the years, and it's post-colonial disability studies. And what that has looked at is how they found that over 80% of the entire world's disabled population is in the global South. And what they're seeing is how that is very much because of a lot of conflicts that have gone on. So when we look at Palestine, for example, that is the largest cohort of child amputees in history. So we see how the liberation of Palestine is also included with that disability justice, and how people are trying to bring that to the front, that all of these issues impact one another. One cannot exist without the other. So when we talk about disability justice, we have to talk about how, you know, certain people get those disabilities. It's a result of war. It's a result of imperialism, and how we can combat that and make sure that we're aware of everything at the same time. I think sometimes people want to make issues separate, but a lot of issues are not separate because our identities are not separate and we cannot separate them. So it's just really keeping that in mind of how all of this can happen at the same time and one does not negate the other. So okay, so the next slide is really touching on your own biases. So we talked about how oppression and privilege can really work in complex ways. And since these are layered, it's not always super obvious who is oppressed and who is privileged. And so that's what you want to keep in mind as well. When you're in policy making, when you're doing policy writing, and your advocacy is not being so quick to decide who is privileged and who is oppressed. These are layered. So these are some examples. While in certain areas, while white people are traditionally privileged, a white person with a physical disability might not bear those same privileges as people within their race, and they might be discriminated against within race. So this really shows how these can be layered. Another example, women face sexism, but there are some women who hold more privileges compared to others. When I look at the feminist history, the history of feminism in the US, we see how there were a lot of different feminist groups because the sort of white feminist group that was emerging, they didn't want to talk about race. And it was Black women there, Latina women also, Indigenous women that were saying that their race plays a really big part in how they are sexualized and how they face sexism. And it wasn't a topic that I think a lot of white feminists wanted to get into. And so that's why people kind of branched off and forming their own things. So you really want to keep in mind that a lot of judgments are, you know, impacted by the other. I had a professor tell me one time that racism is always sexualized and sexism is always racialized. So they all play a part in how somebody will be treated. A final example, men of color face racism, but they can still uphold patriarchy and other misogynistic values. I think, you know, a lot of us can maybe have our own examples, our own viewpoints, especially if you are a woman of color, how men within your race or ethnicity can practice sexism even though you are within the same race. And so finally, just to quickly wrap up, I wanted to touch on the final thing, which is what I often see, and it's so how we combat these oppression Olympics. I've seen this a lot, especially on social media, when people are talking about the ways their identities layer. It's kind of, people think that's so divisive, and you're just trying to see who wins with who's the most oppressed, who has it the worst. But that's not what we're concerned about. Intersectionality is not a battle of who has it worse. This isn't a way of we're just tallying off, you know, what group you're a part of that is the most marginalized. That's not how we're looking at it. It is a comparison, not a competition. So you just want to see what is being talked about, how people are being treated, how their different identities impact how they're being treated, and how we can bring that forward and make sure we address that in a really sustainable way. So overall, the goal is to just not leave anyone behind in our resistance. It's not about further dividing ourselves or pushing other people out. It's about how we can unite people with those differences and bring them to the forefront as well. So that was pretty much the last part of the presentation. We only have about 8 minutes left, but I would like to also I will share it was like a book that I found on, sorry, I can't find my Zoom. On like post-colonial disability studies, because I think that is a really great example of intersectionality and how that's often left out when we even talk about post-colonial studies. I think people are often concerned with race and other impacts of colonization, but how this really impacts people with disabilities and how we can make sure we keep them together. Okay, so now I'm going to look at the chat since I was just not looking. Asking, oh, if the presentation will be shared. I think, yeah, we can absolutely share it. Oh, and they shared their email too. Yeah, and I think decolonizing gender-based violence as well, and how gender-based violence in and of itself was a colonial tool. And so when we're looking at post-colonial, and post-colonial can be its own kind of debated, but when we're looking at the aftermath of a lot of things, how does that impact? Gender-based violence was also heavily racialized with a lot of violent conquerors with various places around the world. So how did that play a role specifically? And also the stereotypes today of women from different places around the world, different nationalities, races, even religions too, how that is often sexualized as well. How does that play a role in the violence that they might face? So I feel like this hour flew by, but I hope this was as fruitful as it could be. Oh yes, I'm glad it was understandable. I feel like um it's just so many layers, and so it's easy to get lost when you're looking at identities, but you can really approach it in a way as long as I think you take your time, you acknowledge your own biases, be as honest with yourself, with the privileges you might hold, and that can really help you to refrain from keeping people left out. Um, I see, I think that's, one of the issues with our feminism today is there are a lot of women that don't want to acknowledge that they hold certain privileges over other women because they think that since we are women, we face sexism, and that's just the end of the discussion. But it really does go beyond that. And we can see how other women can play a big role in the subordination of other women. And so it's being honest in that it's not always as black and white, and that it can be very layered. Awesome. I'm so glad everybody seems to really like it. But yes, feel free to also share your LinkedIns as well, connect with each other afterwards. We have about 5 minutes left, so if anybody wants to ask a question or bring a topic up that wasn't discussed today, please feel free to do so. Any other identity markers that you think are often left out, absolutely, this is the place to do so. I think this can also inspire his work as well. So yeah, with like 5 minutes left, I feel like everybody else can have the floor too. But there will be, yeah, no, go ahead, go ahead.
Go on, go ahead, teacher. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just looking again at the presentation being shared. I think there will be an email afterwards. And so we can include the PowerPoint, I believe.
Thank you so much, teacher. Thank you, thank you, thank you. 1 hour of listening to you felt like we should just keep going and not stop. And absolutely, everything you said was spot on. And to each and every one of you, made time here to be, you lived your time, your work, spent 1 hour with Politics4Her to hear about intersectionality and policy making, and how it all affects our lives one way or the other, either consciously or unconsciously. Thank you all so much for being here. And like Dija said, something that caught my attention, she said, it is not about who has it worse. It's a comparison, not a competition. It's for us to see how we interplay, how the different layers interplay, from gender-based violence to climate to migration. Like someone said in the group chat, medicine, fertility, for us to ask those important questions, to check our bias, because we all have one form of bias or the other, be it consciously or unconsciously. As a Black woman, as a white woman, Latino woman, disabled woman, we all have one way at which we interact, and we can keep doing better, leaving no man behind, and ensuring that we all have our place in this world to be, to act, and to just exist without being forced, because no one is forced to be here. To strip ourselves of layers of patriarchy, sexism, misogyny, and every other ism that hold women and girls back. Because the goal is to not leave anyone forward, to keep moving, to keep pushing despite the barriers. And that's what we're here, right? To keep learning and unlearning. So thank you all so much. We have 3 minutes to the end of this call. And thank you so much, DJ. Yeah.
Of course. I see Julietta asked, like my own experience on working advocating on intersectionality in public policies. I think in the US, it kind of has like a unique way of going about it. I think with reproductive justice, that is a really big intersectional issue for me, in making sure that, with this fight on reproductive justice, how it impacts certain women specifically in this country. The US has some of the highest rates of Black maternal mortality. So how often Black women, pregnant Black women, how often they have very bad medical outcomes throughout their pregnancy, childbirth, afterwards. And so how reproductive justice really does play a large role in this. I think, and then also the history of forced sterilization of Indigenous women in this country as well. So within my own advocacy, it's seeing the topic itself and then seeing who isn't being pushed within that and making sure that it's not seen as just simple. I think people hear reproductive justice and they think it's, abortion access and that's it. And even though that is a large part of it, it goes beyond that. And what do we think about when it comes to reproductive justice in certain places? What issues are we seeing? We're seeing that being pregnant in this country is not the same for every woman. And so how do we address that when we're trying to fight for that justice? So that's some of my very quick experience. I hope that made sense. But yeah, just like within the policies, it's seeing who does that policy greatly affect. And especially with something like that, class has a really big role in that too. So how difficult it might be for women living, below the poverty line to access something like that. So that was my quick experience, but we have probably like less than 60 seconds left. So I just want to send a big thank you again to everybody on this call. And yes, we do have some policy briefs on our website, so feel free to go on our website and read. We try to really maintain that intersectional approach, so absolutely feel free to read those. And I can't wait to read all the great work that you all do too. But again, thank you, and I hope everybody has a good rest of their day, their evening, their night. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for joining. Thank you, Dija. Thank you all.
Thank
And
you.
we've
Bye,
come to the end of
everyone.
our workshop.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
All right.